Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm joined by Keith Preston, and we're going to debate the justification of the state and anarchism. So, as an anarchist, Keith, why don't you open up by giving your account of what you think is illicit or illegitimate or unjustifiable about the state?
Well, in order to really attack something, I think it's first necessary to explain what it is you're attacking. So when anarchists like me say we're against the state, we need to first define what the state is. There's not a universal consensus on that among anarchists, but this is how I would define the state. I would say that to really have an institution that can legitimately be called a state, you'd have to have maybe about a half a dozen or so characteristics. First of all, it would have to be an institution that claims a monopoly on violence in a particular geographical territory. That's the standard Max Weber definition of the state. You would also have to have an institution that claims a monopoly on resources in a particular territory, and that does so for the purpose of protecting an artificially privileged elite. This is Franz Oppenheimer's argument against the state, that the state is based on conquest for the purpose of monopolizing resources, and in the process privileging an artificial elite that would not have their position without the support they get from the state. In addition to have a state, you would have to have an institution that exploits its subjects, because that's necessary to have this artificially privileged elite. That's similar to the Marxist argument, although the Marxists believe that the state is merely an outgrowth of capitalism, and whereas I would tend to say that it's more the opposite, that capitalism is the outgrowth of the state, that capitalism is simply the economic arm of the state. Also, to have a state, it would have to be an organization that seeks to expand its own power, both externally through imperialism or internally as well through bureaucratic thrust and things like that, where the state's always trying to reach into an ever greater number of corners of society. And another characteristic that I think is essential to having a state is all states have some sort of self-legitimating ideological superstructure, and that's some kind of philosophy, religion, ideology that is used to justify the state's existence or the existence of a particular state. Now, that could be any number of things. It could be American exceptionalism, it can be the general will, it could be the dictatorship of the proletariat, it could be the Führer principle, the divine right of kings, the God emperor concept. It could be any number of things. But there has to be some philosophical foundation for the state that is used to legitimize its position. Now, I think that those are the basic characteristics of the state as I would define it. Now, it's also necessary to clarify certain things and also define what the state is not. I would argue that not all institutions or organizations with some of the characteristics that I just mentioned could necessarily be considered states. It's also true, I think, that the state is a continuum, not an absolute category. One analogy I might make would be to something like cancer. We know that people get the disease cancer and die of cancer. Sometimes it may not be necessarily possible to pinpoint exactly when that first cancer cell appeared and the exact millisecond that it appeared or when it appeared. But we do know that cancer cells do develop, they mutate, they metastasize, and then they eventually kill the body. Right? And I think the state develops the same way. There may not be some exact moment where we can say, okay, now we have a state. 5 minutes ago we didn't have a state. But I would argue that an institution or an organization becomes a state to the degree that it starts to exhibit the characteristics I described earlier. Also, the state includes the range of elite interests that are connected to this wider system of exploitation. I would argue, for example, that in a country like the United States, the state is not just Congress or the president or the Supreme Court, the official branches of government. The state is the entire ruling class apparatus that's connected to that. The big corporations, the central banks, the military-industrial complex, the mass media, the elite universities, the elite foundations, all of those kinds of things are part of this wider state system. And also, it's necessary to describe what the state is not. And I think this is where some anarchists, as well as other people, get it wrong. The state is not any form of violence. Right? Something can be violent, groups and organizations as well as individuals, without actually being a state. The guy that sticks a gun in your face in an alley and demands your wallet, he's violent, but he's not a state. a street gang that's getting into drive-by shootings over territories is, they're certainly violent. They're not a state. The state is not any form of hierarchy or authority. A monastery, Buddhist or Christian or whatever, certainly has authority and hierarchy. It's not a state. The state is not just any form of coercion. Let's say a little kid runs out in the street and starts saying he wants to play in the street. His parents tell him to come back out of the street for his own protection. He says he's not going to, so the parents go and pick him up and carry him off. Right, that's coercion, but that's not a state. The parents don't become a state when that happens. The state is not any form of exploitation that's possible. You can tell your girlfriend that you're in love with her because you want to get her into the bed, but that may be exploitation, but that's not a state per se. The state is not any form of organization. The Cub Scouts are not a state. The stamp collector clubs are not a state. Bird watcher clubs are not a state. The state is not a civil war. The state is an institution that has to have a monopoly on power and resources. And this is another issue, and this is important as well. The state is not the root of all evil or everything that's bad. There are some anarchists and libertarians that seem to believe that. They're almost like the Marxists in the sense that the Marxists seem to believe that if only capitalism went away, then nobody would be greedy and everybody would be cooperative and all of our goodness and altruism would shine through. And a lot of anarchists and libertarians, both, different kinds of anarchists, will seem to believe this about the state. Just get rid of this state apparatus and everybody's going to cooperate and be peaceful and follow the non-aggression principle and all of that. I don't think that's the case at all. With or without the state, there's all kinds of things that are bad about people, about life, about the natural world. With or without the state, we're still going to have hurricanes and earthquakes and predatory wild animals and predatory human beings and people that lie, cheat, and steal to get what they want and things like that. So that I'm not arguing that abolishing the state is going to result in the moral regeneration of mankind or human society or anything. I'm simply arguing that the state is an institution that exhibits the characteristics that I described earlier.
Yeah, okay, that's actually a really detailed and interesting definition of the state. The way I would define the state is, I agree with you that Weber is somewhat sparse. It's not necessarily wrong, but it covers too many things. The definition of the state that I'll use is from Aristotle, and in his book, The Politics, he argues that the ideal in society, we should seek to have self-reliance. And the atomic unit of society is not the individual, and as the libertarians believe, nor the collective, as like the Marxists and the fascists believe, but it's the family. And so that basic cellular unit of society is itself a, if you will, proto-state. And what happens then is there's two things. What the family has to do. It has to do at least two things. It has to, A, provide for its own sustenance and self-sufficiency. And it also has to create conditions in which offspring can be raised and then educated to perpetuate the culture that the family is a part of. Now, individual families, much like individuals themselves, can only do so much of that by themselves. And so for the same reason individuals come together to form families, because it's easier to do it if you have other people to work with, not just your spouse, but of course their relations as well. Families come together to form larger assemblies. And these larger assemblies, in the context of Aristotle, were more of city-states of the ancient Greek kind. But he allowed for that extension, the cities then come together to create a federation or get conquered and become an empire. But fundamentally, he viewed that man was a political animal. He said that no man is an island, no man can live by himself. If he lived by himself, he's either a god or an animal. And since man is neither a god nor purely an animal, he must live in community with others. And this desire for community, this desire and need for community and mutual reinforcing aid is developed at different levels of society. So depending on where you look at that level, you have the individual level, the familial level, maybe the county district level, then the city level, then the state level, then the national level. And if you have a world government, which I guess, with Alexander and the Romans, they sort of tried at a global level. And he would argue that at every stage of that process of social interaction, it's the same principle being applied, but just upscaled. And so the state, as he defines it, is a collection of families that come together, much as individuals come together to form families, to do two things: to maintain self-sufficiency and to create a system of education and culture in which that they can then A, raise offspring, and then B, create their own culture, perpetuate through education to that offspring. If it fails in any of those 3 points, it's a failed state. And so I would argue that the state as an institution, whatever your beliefs about it are, with Aristotle, I would argue, are a natural evolution out of the human desire for social interaction and order in the world. So that's how I would define the state. Now, one of the, as far as your definitions of what is and what is not a state, you mentioned the elite interests. Would that be similar to the power elite that was described by Charles Mills Wright?
Well, there's a wide range of elite theorists that postulate the idea of a power elite. You thinking about C. Wright Mills?
Yeah, C. Wright Mills. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, C. Wright Mills' theory of what the power elite is, it holds up as well as any. Now, there are alternative versions of elite theory besides his, from both the left and the right. But as a general rule, I'd say the elite or the ruling class apparatus within any particular state that is the, whose interest the organization of society is geared towards. What's commonly called the leisure class, or what the Marxists call the ruling class. I don't really entirely agree with the Marxist definition of what the ruling class is, but because I think the ruling class is more than just those who control means of production. But I would argue that the elite are those interests connected to the state for whose interest society is organized towards. That's the regardless of what its impact on others would be.
Okay. So I think so if I'm correct, the definition you gave is to be a state, to be considered a state, this institution has to meet all 5 of the criteria you listed: monopoly on violence, monopoly on resources for a privileged minority, institutions that exploit their subjects, seek to expand its power via imperialism or through totalitarian, internal policing, and then a self-legitimating ideology. So if it even lacks one of those, it would not, in your mind, properly be called a state, correct?
For the most part, I would agree with that. Yeah, with some qualifications. I suppose you could have a state that, whose legitimating ideology was not very well inculcated. You can certainly have a state that, the people that over which it rules still hate their rulers, and don't view them as legitimate, and then the state just rules by sheer force and violence. That happens in instances where societies become very polarized, or where a dictatorship or an empire is formed and just rules by conquest. That can happen. That's generally not the norm, though, with states. But I would say that to really have a state, you would have to have this kind of system of exploitation of some particular type. The state is not just any kind of coercion or any kind of organization or any kind of system of rules. I think that's where a lot of anarchists and libertarians actually miss the boat. Is I hear states being defined as all kinds of things coming from some of those circles, and of course among critics of anarchism as well. But I think the state is something more specific than what is often labeled as the state.
Okay, yeah, the reason why I brought that up is because the mafia would meet 1 through 4, but not 5. It has a monopoly on violence. It monopolizes resources in a locality for the mob boss and his family. It has institutions of exploitation, and it seeks to expand its power vis-a-vis other criminal cartels, both internally through intimidation, where you intimidate people within your own cartel, but you also use, gang wars and attack. Like, classic example would be like the different gangs during the Great Depression, where you had the Purple Gang, the Jewish gang, and then you had, the Italians with, I can't think of his name now, but the guy that was busted on tax evasion.
Al Capone.
Al Capone, yeah. And so they didn't really have legitimating ideology, but they do
Well,
meet
uh, uh,
one, 1 to 4. I mean, sorry.
all right, go ahead. No problem. Well, I would argue that they don't necessarily have number one. They don't have a monopoly on violence. The government that, an organized crime group doesn't have a monopoly on violence. The government under which they live and function still has the monopoly on violence. Now, they're a group that's challenging that monopoly, but the government still has a monopoly on violence, as Al Capone and a lot of those other guys found out, um, as,
Ah,
as John Gotti found out. So they don't have a monopoly on violence. Now, they do try to control territory, but they don't exclusively control territory because they still are functioning within a state system. They certainly exist to privilege an exploitive elite. That goes without saying. And they do it by exploiting other people, victims of crimes and extortion rackets and things like that. They don't have a legitimating ideology external to themselves. They have an internally legitimating ideology. The mafia and groups like that have all kinds of initiation ritual ceremonies, as do gangs and other similar groups. Um, so that's why I would say the mafia is not a state. The mafia has some of the characteristics of the state, but it also functions within a wider state system and lacks certain state characteristics as well.
okay. I think one point that might need to be clarified is what do we mean by monopoly on force? So, for an example, within their own territory, if you were beneath Al Capone, he has a monopoly on force vis-a-vis you. But of course, vis-a-vis the state and or federal government, he doesn't, because the feds could come in at any moment. Now, in a hypothetical world, we have a one world government, and it's a global, like Star Trek, and there's there's probably federate nations and then federate states beneath that, beneath that, beneath that. So does the monopoly mean the guy at the highest geopolitical position having the final say? Is that what you mean by a monopoly?
Uh, what I mean is that the monopoly is possessed by he who is able to essentially back up his will by force and have the last word, which, in the case of something like the mafia, is going to be the government. The mafia can certainly, individual members of the mafia can commit crimes. They can conspire with other members of the mafia to commit crimes. But they're still doing this clandestinely. They're still doing this on an underground basis. They can still be arrested and prosecuted and indicted and put in prison and things like that. So they're no different than ordinary criminals in that sense. They just have
Okay.
a sophisticated organization. They don't
So
have a
what?
monopoly on violence.
So okay. So what you're saying is the monopoly on violence is when you use violence, you have the last word on it. But let me give you an
It has to
example.
be credible. You have to have
Credible. Yeah.
a credible monopoly on violence.
Well, let's say that you have a federal government. Let's say the United States in 50 years, the process of centralization is reversed. Or let's go to Mexico right now. Mexico. Let's say the federal government has credible military assets, but in the future it becomes so decentralized because states and cartels grow at a pace that the government can't control, and there's a kind of equilibrium and a standoff. The government could, if it wanted to, go in there and just trash the place, but they could also hit back really hard too with their own assets. Which one of those contenders would be the government?
Well,
Who have the monopoly on force in that case is what I mean.
Well, in the case of a situation like what you have in Mexico, where you have whole sections of the country that have been taken over by these criminal organizations, these cartels, I'd argue that that's essentially this kind of situation you have in a failed state, and it's not the only example we see of that worldwide. You have a system where you don't really have an organization that has a monopoly on the use of violence and has a self-legitimating ideology and these other characteristics. Instead, what you have is a situation where it's not really anarchism either, because it's not anything that would be recognized as anarchism in the ideological sense. It might be anarchy in the pejorative sense, but you have a failed state situation, which is essentially just a type of civil war. I've spent time in Mexico, and what actually happens in Mexico is that you will have different sections of the country and different sections of cities where the government has control, the Mexican government. You'll have other sections where the cartels, one or more cartels will have control. The police in a lot of the Mexican cities are so corrupt, they essentially work as an extortion racket, kind of like the mafia, the stereotype of what the mafia is. In fact, it's so bad in some places that the government, the Mexican government, will actually send in the army, what they call the federales, which are really just the Mexican army. They'll send those in to police the police. I mean, I've actually seen this in Mexican cities. You'll see a guy standing on a street corner in a military uniform with a machine gun or an AK-47, and his job is to keep the cartels from coming into certain sections of cities that are more upper class or middle class areas or tourist areas where they hope to make a lot of money. And they're also there to police the police, to keep the police from preying on tourists and on ordinary citizens. So Mexico is a society that is, at least in certain areas, certain geographical areas, is approaching being an actual failed state. But I don't consider that to be either the state or anarchism. It's more like a civil war.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the other thing is, this is where it gets kind of interesting because see, the more specific you define the state, of course that restricts the category of institutions you can call the state. And we see this as a problem with the late Murray Bookchin. Murray Bookchin later on in life not only sort of abandoned his cynicalism in favor of egoism like Stirner, but he also was known for his praise of the Athenian democracy and of the New England Puritans and their sort of town hall meetings. So, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Athens. Now, some anarchists say, Bookchin, you're not an anarchist anymore because those aren't anarchist societies. But would the Massachusetts Bay Company or would ancient Athens really meet all the criteria that you gave? And how do you negotiate that? Because that was a problem with Bookchin.
Yeah, well, Bookchin is interesting. Bookchin was a lifelong he had actually started off as a Marxist. I think he was a Trotskyist, or maybe he was in the Communist Party initially. I don't know, but by the 1960s at least, when he started writing and becoming well known, he had become an anarchist, and he identified strongly with the anarcho-communist syndicalist tradition. He was somewhat non-sectarian, though, about some of that. Like, he would actually speak at conventions of the Libertarian Party and groups like that, as opposed to denouncing them as fascists like some of the contemporary ANCOMs would. But I actually met Murray Bookchin once years ago, probably about 27 years ago or something like that. But yeah, over time, I think what happened with Murray Bookchin was that he simply became very disdainful of the way the left-wing anarchist movement had become oriented towards lifestyle politics and things like that. And he was more in the old left, revolutionary vein. And I think he decided, though, that the working class had lost its revolutionary potential in modern societies, similar, ironically, to the Frankfurt School critique. And he started developing this philosophy that he called communalism, which I view as just anarcho-communism under another name, although he had this orientation towards independent municipalities that are self-managed and things like that. But there are several issues that come out of that. First, as far as the definition of the state that you were giving earlier, citing Aristotle, it might be a bit presumptuous to disagree with Aristotle, but I'm going to have to disagree with Aristotle. I don't agree that the state and the family are analogous to one another. I think that's like comparing apples and oranges. There was an essay that Herbert Spencer wrote back in the 19th century where he addressed this issue of the relationship between the state and the family, and he was arguing that state ethics and family ethics are different categories of endeavor, or different categories of human behavior. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the direction he was trying to take this in, but I think the critique itself stands. What I would argue is that there's a natural bond between families and people who are blood relatives, or people who are close members of the same community, or friends. There's a natural bond there that doesn't exist between the state and its subjects. I would argue the relationship between the state and subjects is not like a family relationship. It's more like the relationship between a robber and a victim, or the relationship maybe between a CEO and an employee, or something like that. I think that the family equals the state idea is comparing apples and oranges. I think that's a bit of a reach. Now, I would qualify that by saying that it's certainly possible to have social organization where you have families, you have extended families, you have communities, In more traditional societies, you have tribes and clans and all of that. You find that in traditional societies all over the world among indigenous people and so forth. That form of social organization is not necessarily a state. A collection of tribes and clans is not necessarily a state per se. It becomes a state. I mean, you can even have a representative, tribal clan system where you have councils of elders and things that make decisions for the group. But that's not a state. It only becomes a state when this system of artificial or non-organic privilege is imposed. And as far as like the Greek cities and all that, I've discussed this with you before on some of the other podcasts we've done, but the way I see statism is, once again, I see statism as a continuum. It's not this one point where we say statism over here, non-statism over here. I'd say that the state is more like a 0 to 100 scale. If we say pure anarchism is 100 and something like Kim Jong-un or Pol Pot or something like that is 0, then most institutions that we call states are certainly in between those, anywhere from maybe Switzerland or Liechtenstein, which is in the 70-80% range, and something like some of the more authoritarian states that are in the 30-40% range. Most of our modern liberal democracies are probably in the 50-60% range. So that's the scale on which I would evaluate this whole continuum of statism. And it's how that would relate to something like the Greek cities or the New England town meetings. I would say that those are maybe small states or minor states or maybe prototypical states that certainly could have the potential to evolve into states. The Greek cities internally certainly had characteristics that I would consider to be statist. Number one, they had slaves in those systems. Number one, the status of women in those Greek cities was actually very low. A lot of modern people talk about how enlightened and progressive the ancient Greeks were. No, the women had the same status as they do in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan and places like that. And they had slavery. They executed Socrates for heresy or whatever. So these were authoritarian, exploitative state systems. Now, they weren't on the massive scale as some of the other ancient empires. And for that reason, I think they did reach a higher level of cultural and political achievement than many of the other ancient civilizations did. The Greek cities were, they were states. They were prototypical states, perhaps. But they weren't the Persian Empire. They weren't Babylon. They weren't Egypt. They weren't any of these other ancient tyrannies. So
okay. So real quick, so basically, to use a biblical example, the patriarchs and the judges are maybe like 10 to 20. Saul might be like a 50. David is getting maybe to a 70, and by the time you get to Solomon, you're like 90, 95. Because by that point,
that works, but you've got the numbers in reverse.
Sorry.
The dictator, absolute monarch, is the 0. So Solomon is the 0, and then the passage from the book of Samuel. I forgot if it's
1 Samuel 8. Yeah, that'd be like maybe a 95.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly right. Or if we look at New England, the town meetings, and not just the New England town meetings, but some of the utopian religious colonies that existed in early America, the Quaker colonies and the Hutterites and Shakers and all the others. Those were quasi-anarchistic systems that were sort of prototypical states, and then they kind of grew into states over time. And to the degree that they exercised artificial privilege over their members or over others, over their subjects, they became states. Certainly the something like the Salem witch trials, I'd argue that's certainly a type of statism there. I mean, it's a religious persecution, or the treatment of the Quaker people that you would see in some of the New England communities as well. But they're still, they weren't the Spanish Empire, of the time. I mean, they weren't that, or any of the European empires, but they were, mini states, prototypical states. And again, to look at this scale that I'm talking about, the sliding scale, we can find all kinds of examples of that. One example is the U.S. Constitution, right? On one hand, the U.S. Constitution is an interesting mixture of a lot of libertarian ideas, like the separation of powers, divided sovereignty, representative democracy, the Bill of Rights, and all of these things. but it still exists within this kind of meta system of a capitalist class dictatorship. I think that's one thing the Marxists get right in their interpretation of American history, and that the U.S. constitutional system was actually set up to be a type of capitalist class or proto-capitalist class dictatorship, and you see that if you look at all the different writings of the authors of the Constitution and the specific things they disliked about the Articles of Confederation. They didn't like the fact that the states had laws that were too friendly to debtors. They didn't like the fact that there wasn't a more organized, efficient system of returning fugitive slaves. They didn't like the fact that they weren't able to easily raise an army to suppress farmer rebellions like Shays' Rebellion and Bacon's Rebellion, or the Whiskey Rebellion. They didn't like the fact that they weren't able to expand westward as rapidly and as efficiently as they wanted to. So, you see this kind of quasi-libertarian system being merged with this kind of class dictatorship that's in early American history. So again, it's a scale. It's not just absolute categories. And I think both a lot of anarchists and anti-anarchists make that mistake. There's a whole lot of gray area in some of these kinds of things.
Sure. One thing that I wish I had pointed out earlier was to flesh out Aristotle a little bit more and give you a kind of a complete classical political theory. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, discusses virtue and vice. And virtue and vice are attributes or habits that an individual can acquire by performing acts that are either virtuous or vicious. And the way it usually sets up was courage is a good example. Courage is the golden mean. You have excess or a deficiency. Excess and deficiencies are both vices, but they're not equally bad. So rashness is an excess. Cowardice is a deficiency. They're both vices, but rashness is better than cowardice. Now, then he divides there's three kinds of government. There's rule of the one, rule of the few, and rule of the many. And each form of government has a virtuous and a vicious side. The rule of the one who's virtuous is the king, monarchy. The vicious one is the tyranny. The rule of the few that is virtuous is the aristocracy. The rule of the many, or few, which is bad, is an oligarchy. The rule of the many, which is good, is politeia, polity, from where we get the word politics. And then the bad form is democracy. Now, the reason why the virtuous ruler acts in such an interest for the interest of the well-being of the whole. And this is again where he gets into the family dynamic. The husband acts with the authority over the woman, his wife and children, but for their own betterment. Whereas the dictator and the tyrant acts against their best interests. So now then he says that the next level would be the republic, which comes from Cicero. And he argues that the republic is a compilation of all three forms of government. So in the U.S. context, which I think was partly inspired by Cicero and Aristotle, is that the president is supposed to be the monarchical executive element. The Congress and Senate are, more supposed to be the Senate, the republic, the aristocratic element. Then there's the popular wing of the government, which I forget right now what it is, where it's more of a popular voice. For England, rather, it's like the House of Commons is the democratic element, and the House of Lords is the aristocratic element, and the Queen or the Prime Minister is the executive element. But regardless, that's how the classical political theory fleshes out. And I more or less accept the contours with some minor tinkering here and there. But you made an interesting point about families and the state being disanalogous. So you said that, families are usually based off of blood relations. Now, I suppose where we have two thought experiments here we could use one and say, well, let's say a tribe, I'll use the Hebrews, grow to such a number that they're all still related by blood from one ancestral person, Jacob. But by now there's hundreds of thousands of them. But they're still related in blood, however distant, and they still see themselves as the same people, and other people are different than them. When they get to a certain size, they'll need institutions that are a lot larger than your average tribal council. And the other thing is, a family can have the same sort of intimate relation with a person not of their blood. So, for example, in the Roman Empire, there was a practice called adoption. Now, adoption for them is a little bit different than for us. You could adopt somebody, and he could be a full heir to you, and you couldn't disinherit him once you made that decision. But your own flesh and blood son could be disinherited. So you have this, he's a family member, one of the family, but he could be from a freed slave, could be anybody. And so we have the disanalogy, I think, doesn't quite work because we could have families that are closely, intimately bonded together, even if they're not of the same blood. And the same blood can still grow to such a tribal size that it becomes a de facto state because of its size.
Well, I'm familiar with the different typologies of different types of states that Plato and Aristotle and others wrote about. I would have several issues with that. First, when I was talking about family ethics versus state ethics, and I was talking about how the family is an institution of natural bonding, I didn't necessarily just mean blood relatives. It certainly, blood relatives are a big part of that, but there's also adopted family members by marriage, members of your local community, your next door neighbor who were de facto family. And you can also have extended quasi-families of people that are not directly related to each other. Like, for example, instead of using the family, the biological family as an analogy, we could talk about a large group of people that have some other common affinity. Let's say Star Wars fans or comic book fans or something like that. Okay, well, you could have this organization or federation or a set of tribes of Star Wars fans, and they're oriented towards going to Star Wars fan conventions and dressing up like their favorite Star Wars characters and all that. And they could even do this in a very formalistic way. You could have the council of elders of the Star Wars fan club with their, they could make policies for the club and things like that. But I would disagree that something like that would constitute a state. It's not necessarily there to maintain some kind of system of exploitation. I mean, there may still be conflict internally. Somebody wants to declare February Luke Skywalker month. Somebody else wants February to be Darth Vader month or something like that. There could be conflict, but it's not necessarily a system of privileging some through the exploitation of others. So I argue that that's the problem I see with the family analogy. Now, as far as the typologies that Plato and Aristotle and others were using, I'd have to say that, in what context did they develop this set of theories? And what I see them doing is developing a set of political theory that is essentially being used to legitimize the pre-existing systems that they were a part of. They may have looked at, the Greek monarchies as opposed to the tyrannies or the oligarchies versus the democracies, and said, well, this one functions better than that one. This king or ruler or whatever is more benevolent than this other one. This democratic city-state elects better leaders or votes for better policies than this other one. But underlying all that is still this pre-existing system of exploitation. Like I said, they had slaves in that system. Women were treated as chattel in that system. They persecuted heretics and political dissidents in those systems. All of that stuff predates these kinds of city-states that they had. Now these city-states in Greece may not have been, they may not have been the Romans, they may not have been the Persians, they may not have been the Egyptians or the Babylonians, but they were still a system of an exploitive state system, or at least proto-states. So I think that the problem with some of the typologies that come out of classical philosophy is what is its foundation? I mean, what premise are they arguing from? We could transfer that to modern politics, and we could look at governments around the world, and we could say, well, okay, the Western liberal parliamentary democracies generally, not always, but generally afford their people a greater set of individual civil rights or political rights, or maintain a higher standard of living for their people or something like that than, say, North Korea or some of the countries that are ruled by African dictators or the remnants of the Hindu caste system in India. But it's still a case that all of these systems have this pre-existing system of exploitation that underlies it. We could even look at that within a domestic political system, within a singular state. We can look at American history, and we could say, okay, we've had 45 presidents. Some of them were better than others. Some of them did awful things. Some of them did good things. And it may be that these individual presidents, in terms of their personal character, may have been virtuous individuals, or at least strive to be virtuous individuals. I don't know that at least some of the U.S. presidents have necessarily been people that wanted the common people to be miserable or unhappy or oppressed or anything like that. But it's still within their system of rules still took place within this wider system of non-organic artificial privilege and rulership. Take a guy like Jimmy Carter, for example. By all accounts, Jimmy Carter is a decent guy. He seems to be in his personal life, in his non-political professional life. Contrary to what many people believe, I don't think he was the worst president we ever had. I actually think he was one of the better ones. But he was still part of this same system, this same kind of system of this kind of state capitalist class dictatorship, this kind of system of state exploitation. And he became a part of that system, and that's what all of the individual presidents do. In fact, that's one thing that the anarchists will always say. Well, look, you voted for this guy, and look what he became. He became part of the system. So I think the problem is the underlying system. Whether the individual ruler aspires to be a decent person on a personal level or not is certainly a relevant issue, but not really the crux of the issue. In fact, I saw something related to that was interesting recently. I was reading about Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and I was reading about a fellow who had known him during his teenage years. And this fellow was another North Korean. He worked for the family, the ruling family. I forgot what his capacity was. Maybe it was like the chef or something, some position like that. But he talks about how he would go out and shoot basketball hoops with Kim Jong-un when Kim Jong-un is like 18 years old or 16 or something like that. And he mentioned once that Kim Jong-un said, well, you and I, being part of the state, the elite, we have it good. But what about the people? They don't really have it that good. And he seemed genuinely troubled by this or concerned about this. Another story this guy tells about Kim Jong-un is that apparently at one point there was a collapse of an apartment building in North Korea, and a lot of the people living there died. It was like a terrible thing where people were killed and things like that. And he said that Kim Jong-un seemed genuinely troubled by this. He seemed genuinely upset that this had happened and that people had died. And that's not the image we have of him in the West, obviously. We have this image of him as this tyrant that's a maniac. He orders people executed for trivial reasons and to consolidate his own power. He's more like John Gotti or something like that. And probably he has both sides to that, both of those sides to his personality or character or something like that. So the point being that it is a system that is based on exploitation and privilege by non-organic or artificial means and backed up by coercive force and so forth is going to produce these kinds of negative results. It doesn't really matter whether the individual ruler, the king, the president, the prime minister, or the congressman or whatever thinks this is a good thing or not, or whether he or she aspires to be a personally virtuous person or not. Maybe they are, maybe they do, maybe they don't. That all depends on the individual. So it's the system that's the problem, in other words.
Okay. I have three questions that I think are all kind of related to this. So the first question is, you made a distinction that, ancient Athens had state-like properties because it had slavery. Women were seen as being disadvantaged, at least from our perspective, seen as disadvantaged by their society. Now, the traditional family system, going back as far back as we have recorded history, up until the 1920s, within different societies, women had more or less liberties than they do, but they were fundamentally subjected to their husbands in a legal fashion. Now,
real quick, let me just qualify that by saying that in ancient Greece, in many of those cities, women were not allowed to be seen in public unless they were prostitutes. I mean, they have the same status as, say, women under the Taliban or something like that. That's a whole different matter than the Western tradition, where we didn't have women's suffrage until 1919 or something like that. That's a much different system.
Okay, but what I'm getting at is, do you see the disanalogy arising because of the unequal power relationships between, say, the husband and his wife and the parents and their children, as opposed to the civil authorities versus their subjects?
Yeah, I think that is a disanalogous relationship. Yeah, I think that there can be power imbalances in an institution or organization or set of relationships without that being a state per se. In fact, one disagreement that I have with a lot of the left-wing anarchists or anarcho-communists and people like that is that they will say that any kind of organization is a form of authoritarianism in some instances. Others say that if there's not perfect equality down to the nth degree in some kind of organization or institution, that by itself is a state. Um, they will say that to be an anarchist, you also have to be against hierarchy or authority of any kind. I think that's a separate question. I think you can be for or against the state and have whatever views about authority or hierarchy in other contexts. But I think it's possible, for example, for a family to be internally patriarchal or whatever in a traditionalist sense, where dad is the head of the household, or if it's an extended family, great grandfather, great great grandpa is the head of the household, and where women, children, even adult sons have a somewhat subordinate position. I think that that's more analogous to something like a business, or of course, a lot of anarchists don't believe in a hierarchical business
Okay.
either. But the state is unique in the sense that it has the properties that I described at the beginning of our discussion. The state has this system of not only hierarchy, not only exploitation, not only coercion, but a monopoly on these things for the purpose of monopolizing resources and for the purpose of privileging a non-organic, artificially privileged elite through exploitation, backed up by coercion and with a self-legitimating ideology.
Okay. The second question, I'm going to open up with a quotation from St. Augustine, The City of God, Book 4, Chapter 4, about the pirate in Alexander. Justice being taken away, then what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms? The band itself is made up of men. It is ruled by the authority of a prince. It is knit together by the pact of a confederacy. The booty is divided by the law agreed on. If by the admittance of abandoned men, this evil increases to such a degree that it holds fixed places, fixed abodes, takes possession of cities and subdues peoples, it assumes the more plainly the name of a kingdom, because the reality is now manifestly conferred on it, not by the removal of covetousness, but by the addition of impunity. Indeed, that was an apt and true reply which was given to Alexander the Great by the pirate who had seized him. For when that king has been asked the man what he meant by keeping hostile possession of the sea, he answered with bold pride, "What do you mean by seizing the whole earth? But because I do it with a petty ship, I am called a robber, while you who do it with a great fleet are styled an emperor." So the point that I want to ask about this is, you seem to think that the institution of the state of necessity is corrupting to virtue. Now, is it possible that there could be a system that meets all the state, well, most of those criteria that you gave for the state, but the institution itself is bent towards virtue? So it's not so much you have a lottery where you get a virtuous individual that just happens to pop in. The classical and medieval concept of justice and a virtuous state was that the institutions of the state itself were conditioned towards virtue. Well, again, it's teleological. Teleology is the study of purpose and direction. If the state was directed towards, its institutions were directed towards what's the good, then it's virtuous. If its institutions were directed against what's bad, it's vicious. So is it impossible on your account for a state to ever be virtuous in that sense? Because you seem to think that they're all vicious in the sense that the apparatus is always bent towards hurting people.
Again, I think it's a continuum. I don't think it's a matter of absolute categories, but I would say, yeah, ultimately the anarchists are right when they say that the state is like a criminal organization writ large. That the part of the quote from Augustine you just read, where he said that, where he compares the what is, or like the story at the end where they're saying, well, what is the emperor but a pirate writ large? Ultimately, I agree with that, and I think that that's what the state ultimately is. It's a criminal gang writ large that maintains a monopoly on power and has this self-legitimating ideological superstructure and all that. Now, it's also true that there can be different levels of this. I mean, you can have a state that is more or less virtuous as opposed to one that just like you can have a criminal gang that's more or less virtuous. Like you have some criminal gangs, for example, that they generally have an internal policy that they don't kill unless it's necessary, or if they kill somebody, you're expected to do it with a one clean shot or thrust of a sword or whatever. You have other criminal gangs that go out of their way to kill people even when it doesn't even seem to benefit them that much. You have others that go out of their way to make their victims suffer, just to set an example or display their power for its own sake. So, and you have states like that as well. You have states that may be less oppressive than others, or more oppressive than others. Getting back to Franz Oppenheimer earlier, he was a classical liberal theorist that lived in Germany in the early 20th century. And he argued that modern liberal democratic states had sort of taken the kinds of oppression that you find in ancient tyrannies, like the Babylonians and all of that, and the Romans, and watered it down a bit to where modern democracies gave their people a higher standard of living, a better system of political representation, or more civil rights and things like that. Now, I also think there's a lot of criticisms of modern liberal democracy that don't get voiced, that are interesting as well. But we can argue certainly that some states are better than others. I mean, we can look at the current government of China under President Xi and say, well, there's plenty of things wrong with that system, but it's not what it was during the Great Leap Forward. Or, we can look at the government of Russia and look at what Putin is doing and say, well, there are problems with him, but he's not Joseph Stalin. And we can look at any system and make those kinds of different variations. I mean, even different states can evolve and change over time. I mean, the government of Iran today has its issues, but it's not what it was during the Ayatollah's revolution back in 1979 and 80. And Cambodia, the government of Cambodia today, whatever its problem, it's not the Khmer Rouge. So certainly some states can be worse than others. Some states can be more oppressive or more tyrannical than others. Some rulers, heads of state, political authorities can be more well-intentioned than others. But I think ultimately state systems are still based on this system of oppression and exploitation, and they still are ultimately this criminal gang writ large, irrespective of the personal motivations of their individual members. Whether Jimmy Carter really cared about human rights or not is an interesting question, but I really think that's kind of beside the point.
Yeah. Okay. I think maybe I didn't ask the question maybe as precisely as I needed to, but let me refine it with two more questions. When the medieval and classical thinkers and philosophers say that it's as the quote that I wrote, Augustine said that a state without virtue, or justice is the word he used, is a robber state. Now, what he means by that is if the state is if its institutions are, forget the individuals, look at the institutions. Are the institutions permanently or more often than not bent against virtue, which means they're vicious? Now, if they're more or less bent towards virtue, then it's more or less virtuous. So would it be the case that have there been any virtuous states, do you think, in that sense in history? And then B, is it possible in theory or in practice?
No, I understood your original question. Maybe I didn't answer it as clearly as I could have. No, Augustine was saying that a state can be like an individual. It can be virtuous or non-virtuous, and with varying degrees of scales of virtue. And I guess he's saying that if the preponderance of virtue is greater than the preponderance of non-virtue, then it's generally a just state. I would ultimately have to say no to that, because I'd have to say that, again, as I understand and define the state by its nature is built on exploitation and oppression. Now, you can have a state that's less exploitive or less oppressive, or rulers that are less predatory or benevolent. So that scale does exist. Then that gets into arguments that a lot of traditional conservatives make. Well, shouldn't a state that is generally more benign than others be given the benefit of the doubt? And then when you start talking about things like revolutions, I mean, under what circumstances should you be willing to embrace the kind of dislocations and uncertainty and upheaval that come with revolutions? Isn't it better to tolerate a state that's oppressive but at least keeps order, or at least tolerate a state that at least does some virtuous things, and and just overlook the non-virtuous things? That's a separate set of arguments. I think those issues involve a lot of different kinds of complexities that are involve somewhat different questions. But as I define the state, there's no such thing as a virtuous state. Ultimately, I mean, the state, as I understand, as I interpret it, is the criminal, the mafia with a flag. That's the traditional anarchist view of the state, the mafia with a flag, but a mafia that's gaining a monopoly on what's perceived to be the legitimate use of power. Some mafias may be worse than other mafias, and some mafia leaders may be less virtuous than others. But it's not. It's a matter of scale. It's not something that I think can really be legitimated on its own terms.
Yeah, okay. I think, well, there's a third question I want to ask, but I think to wrap this one up, I think part of the way that we look at the state is born out of a fundamental, deeper disagreement between moral realism and moral anti-realism, which is, again, beyond the scope of this actual debate. But being a follower of Nietzsche and Max Stirner, I think you would agree with the moral anti-realist that moral truths, moral reality is doesn't actually exist outside of us. It's something that we might create because it's convenient to prevent us from slitting each other's throats, but it's not actually real.
All right, that's my point of view. Not all anarchists or libertarians believe that. There are many libertarians and anarchists that are moral realists of some type. They believe in natural rights, the kinds of ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. There are some religious anarchists that actually believe in divine command ethics. And there are others that believe in natural justice and all of these kinds of things. I tend to take more of a subjectivist view of those kinds of questions, in the sense that I think, ethics, morals, values, virtues, those are ideas that we create for ourselves based on our own perceived needs and interests. For example, some of the more basic things like that. Societies have rules against murder, for the sake of individual and collective self-protection. It's whether murder is right or wrong in some cosmic sense might just be somebody's opinion, but but ultimately, for most people, the right to not be murdered is more important than the right to murder other people. There are some people who don't feel that way, but most people do. And the same is true with any set of ethical values. We could use a comparison to animals. When you have a wild animal that preys on humans or preys on other animals or things like that, well, maybe we could say, well, that animal is not a virtuous animal. Well, maybe he is, or maybe he isn't, that bear or mountain lion or tiger or whatever. But the bottom line is, you still have to protect yourself against this wild animal, or you have to protect your garden against this wild animal, your livestock against this wild animal. That really, to me, is the basis of things like virtue and ethics and things of that nature. I don't really buy into a lot of the kind of cosmic justifications for ideas like that many people have. Although, as I said, that's not true of all anarchists and libertarians. Many, in fact, I'd be inclined to argue even the majority of anarchists or libertarians are moral realists, as opposed to moral skeptics or subjectivists like I am. So that's one issue. But again, I guess it gets down to this question of, how do we define justice? In the first place, I tend to look at it like justice is, again, culturally relative, and it's subjective to the human experience. When we say that the state is a system that is built on exploitation, oppression, it's a criminal gang writ large, there may not be anything wrong with that in some cosmic sense. The asteroids out in space may not care about that, but it's relative to our own experience. For most people, not being oppressed is more important to them than the right to oppress others. Again, not everybody feels that way. There are outliers, but that's really the crux of the issue, as I would understand it. This is a very pragmatic, though subjective, approach to ethics.
Yeah. I was just pointing out, I think that's a fundamental to solve the problem of our definition of the state, we'd have to dig a little deeper than we can tonight. But the other question that I wanted to ask you was, now you've actually, I think, written about this some years ago as well, but Hans Hermann Hoppe kind of made in Democracy, the God That Failed, this kind of, even a lot of anarcho-capitalists were a little sketchy about it, but he said that the monarchy was a private state and was really fundamentally different than states as we think of them, because monarchies were just essentially private governments, and they were similar to anarcho-capitalism. I mean, not identical, obviously. He wants to move beyond throne and altar, but he does seem to think, at least in Democracy, the God That Failed and elsewhere, that monarchies are private states, much like he would envision a future anarcho-capitalist society where private actors run military corporations, or like, I don't know, Walmart-style corporations. So what do you think about his whole monarchy anarcho-capitalist fusion analysis thing?
Well, when he published his book, Democracy, the God That Failed, I wrote a review of it originally I wrote that for antistate.com, which was an anarcho-capitalist website that was around back then. This was about 15 years ago. And I gave Hoppe a glowing review of that particular book. And the main reason I did so was because at the time I was very interested in exploring ideas that critiqued modern systems of liberal democracy. And it was rare that I came across material of that type. And the reason for that was, the reason I was interested in that topic was, it always seemed to me that most people, quote unquote, normal or mainstream people in our modern, Western liberal capitalist parliamentary societies, most people are really anarchists. Maybe you're not, but most people are really anarchists when it comes to all forms of the state except the liberal democratic state. You don't really find that many ordinary people off the street in the modern industrial technological societies who would claim to be monarchists or proponents of a hereditary aristocracy, or ruled by an elite oligarchy, or who were advocates of a theocracy or a military dictatorship, or fascism or Nazism, or communism, the way the Bolsheviks envisioned it. Most people, I mean, probably 99 plus, well, maybe 90+% of people in modern societies believe that liberal democracy is a legitimate form of the state and the only legitimate form of the state. We don't really, for that reason, I've never believed that anarchists like myself needed to waste a whole lot of time talking about, for example, how awful fascism is, like a lot of these anarchists do today. Of course, fascism is an awful system. Of course, Stalinism is an awful system. Of course, an absolute monarchy is an awful system. Of course, a military dictatorship is an awful system. Not that many people in today's world disagree with that. But it's liberal democracy that has this facade of being government of the people, for the people, by the people, and is what is considered legitimate. So I was very interested in Hoppe's efforts to attack liberal democracy, because what he essentially argues is that liberal democracy is basically the rule by 51%. It's 51. It's the 51 wolves and the 49 sheep voting on what to have for dinner. It's also ruled by coalitions of interest groups trying to extract value from one another. Essentially different kinds of economic, political, and cultural groups trying to essentially plunder or suppress their opponents and things of that nature. So it's rare that you find that much writing that critiques liberal democracy. Now, you do find criticisms of democracy in pre-modern political theory, some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, Plato and Aristotle, and then later Aquinas, and obviously a lot of the throne and altar traditionalists, thinkers like Joseph de Maistre and Louis de Bonnell and Cortez. And then even in modern political philosophy, you find critics of mass democracy like Jose Ortega y Gasset and Bertrand de Juvenal, and on the more extreme fringes, Julius Evola and thinkers like that. Carl Schmitt actually is interesting in that regard. In fact, that's actually how I developed an interest in Carl Schmitt as well, was because he was another one of the few modern thinkers that would actually liberal democracy to any kind of criticism.
Or, what I was trying to get at was, you one point in one of your reviews for Attack the System, you called the Society of Hoppe anarcho-Stalinism.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I wanted to maybe get at a little bit more.
Okay. Well, I wrote a very glowing review of Hoppe's book, and then I wrote a follow-up where I criticized certain aspects of it that I disagreed with. And one was this idea that he kind of envisions anarchic systems that are kind of like feudatories, ruled by these kind of crypto monarchs. And he's talking about how he wants to expel people from different societies. In fact, he's actually gotten famous for that now, for the physical removal line in his one of his books, where he's talking about, well, in a true libertarian society, we're going to have to kick out Democrats and socialists and communists and all these other. It goes down this long list of groups that he doesn't like. At the time, I think I wrote something like, it sounded like the Stalinist rhetoric against bourgeois cosmopolitans, or something like that. But yeah, so there are certain aspects of his thinking that I think are problematic in that regard. I'm not a monarchist either. I mean, I don't know that I really agree with Hoppe's view on monarchism as being a stateless system, or really being even comparable to anarcho-capitalism. I mean, a monarchist system was more like our modern dictatorships, in my view. I mean, every system of monarchism. You did have types of monarchies that were more, where the monarchy had to share power with other institutions. Like during the Middle Ages in Europe, the monarchies could never really get a monopoly on power. They were always having to share power with the aristocracies, with the church, with the guilds, with the free cities, with all these other institutions. But what happened over time, for whatever reason, the monarchies started to get absolute power and become absolute monarchies. And I would argue that absolute monarchies are like modern dictatorships. They're predecessors to modern dictatorships. They had the same kinds of powers that modern dictators had, and would use them in similar ways. I think, for example, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled all of the Jews from Spain at one point. And that's just an example. I mean, there are plenty of other examples like that. So I don't agree with that aspect of Hoppe's work. I do like his criticisms of liberal democracy, not so much his defense of traditional monarchies.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it was all really interesting, but that was kind of the question I wanted you to answer, because I think because Hoppe's kind of, again, that line between when you cross into statism, when you cross into anarchism, he's trying to give his own account of it, and it's an interesting one, even if it's not wholly satisfying. Is there anything else you wanted to say about Hoppe or the classics or anything like that?
Not specifically, no.
Okay, so I'm thinking it's been about an hour. We should probably wrap it up. Is there anything you want to say before we end?
If I could, I'd like to go through just a small trajectory here about how I see some of the arguments for the state.
Sure.
I could give an overview of that. I take the arguments for the state seriously. I mean, I consider them to be serious intellectual arguments. I don't dismiss people who make arguments for the state as being unenlightened morons or something like that. These are all interesting ideas. The one argument for the state is the argument of inevitability. Probably the most advanced version of that is the iron law of oligarchy. Robert Michaels, a sociologist from the early 20th century, a former anarcho-syndicalist, actually developed this idea called the iron law of oligarchy, which says that all organizations of any size are by definition going to be oligarchies, where the few lead the many, and that's going to be the state as well as any other kind of institutions, parties, businesses, unions, etc. I would say that whether the iron law of oligarchy is true or not, there's still a difference between non-state organizations and the state itself. Even if we could make the argument that the state is inevitable from the point of view, the state as I've defined it previously is inevitable from the point of view of the iron law of oligarchy, I'd still say that using that to legitimize the state per se has a problem that sort of leans towards the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy being the idea that if something occurs in nature, it must be good. Even if the state is inevitable, according to the iron law of oligarchy, I would say that it's inevitable in the same sense that hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes are inevitable, or that disease is inevitable, or that predatory criminal individuals are inevitable. It doesn't mean that we don't look askance at these things. It doesn't mean that we don't make efforts to safeguard ourselves against these things. We could say, for example, well, crime just occurs in nature. Violent crime just occurs in nature. Let's just let these criminal types just have free reign. All right, that wouldn't really be a very practical approach. And I'd say that about the state as well. Whether ruled by an exploitive oligarchy is inevitable or not, it's still good to safeguard against that the best we can. Thomas Jefferson's idea on eternal vigilance and all that. Now, another argument that's often used for the state is what I call the argument for semantics. And that basically says this: the question is, aren't anarchists really just advocating for a different kind of state? And again, I think the key issue there is some people obtaining privileges over others they would not have if the state were not assisting them. That argument, I think, also has to be qualified in the sense of, relative to an individual's place in a wider set of social and political and economic hierarchies. For example, we could say somebody on food stamps is being assisted by the state, but they're not part of the ruling class, they're not part of the elite class, and they're certainly not part of the leisure class. There's also practical arguments for the state. There's, what about defense? What about economic development? What about provision of services? What about protection of, say, civil rights against, exclusionary local communities? What about internal order per se, crime and all that? There's actually a great deal of anarchist and libertarian writing about this issue, addressing this issue. I'm not going to go into all those arguments. We don't have time, but one of my favorite pieces of writing on that is an essay by Kirkpatrick Sale called "The Necessity of the State," and he says he has necessity in scare quotes because he doesn't really believe in the necessity of the state. But that's a great essay that really addresses those questions on very simple, lay people level terms. The Necessity of the State by Kirkpatrick Sale, who's the sort of the founder of bioregionalism. There are other works like this as well. There's a book called Reinventing Anarchy and Reinventing Anarchy Again. It's a series that addresses some of these practical questions. The writings of Colin Ward, he's a British anarchist who's written about this a bit. He has a book called Anarchy in Action that's something of a classic. So that's one argument. Now, other sets of arguments for the state are the philosophical arguments that are used in modern philosophy. You've talked about the arguments from classical philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, some of that. There's also thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, who introduced ideas like the social contract, implicit consent, popular sovereignty. Those arguments have already been criticized by a lot of anarchist and libertarian thinkers, as well or better than I could. So I'll just leave that be, except to say that I think those kinds of arguments are essentially assuming too much. I think that the Hobbesian, Rousseauan social contract theory is kind of a radical. It's kind of a rhetorical trick. It's something that it's essentially asserting what it wishes to prove when there's really not much substance there when you try to peel away the actual argument and the actual substance behind the argument. There are other arguments for the state. One was at least Nietzsche came close to advancing this argument. I don't know that he fully advanced this argument or was a true serious believer in this, but Nietzsche and some others, similar thinkers, argue that the state is necessary for the development of a leisure class. Like they will argue that, well, yeah, the state creates this kind of oppressive and exploitive oligarchy, and that's good because that oligarchy becomes a leisure class, and it's this leisure class that creates culture. While everybody else works, they're all doing science and art and philosophy and all of these things, and that's how we get Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and Napoleon and all these great figures. That's one argument. To that I'd say that we certainly don't need a tyrannical state or an exploitive leisure class to create culture. And even if we do, at what cost? That's another issue. Lastly, I think another issue is everybody that I have ever known personally who was not an anarchist, who believed in a state of some kind, didn't believe that just any kind of state was okay. I touched on this earlier a little bit, but everybody I have ever known personally who was a statist believed that their preferred model of state was the correct state. It's not just any kind of state. Now, there are some people that come close to taking the position that just any kind of state is good as long as it keeps order. Bill Lind actually comes pretty close to this. I've seen stuff that he's written where he says, well, whatever else could be said about the North Koreans, at least they keep order. They prevent fourth generation warfare from arising or whatever. I suppose if order is all you care about, that kind of argument might mean something. I don't know that I would be prepared to take it that far, and I think most people wouldn't either. I also, as I said earlier, most modern people really believe that liberal democracy is the only legitimate form of state. They really are anarchists when it comes to monarchies, aristocracies, oligarchies, theocracies, military dictators, fascism, communism, and Nazism. They're only statists when it comes to liberal democracy. And even then, it has to be their own sectarian form of liberal democracy. For example, there's a lot of people I know personally nowadays on the liberal and left end of the spectrum who insist that Trump is not a legitimate president, or his regime is not a legitimate regime, for whatever reason. So I guess many people are kind of approaching anarchism in that way. We can also look at the historical trajectory behind some of these things, and we can see that we see proto-anarchistic ideas throughout many different kinds of societies and many different kinds of philosophical traditions and cultural traditions and indigenous societies throughout history. We can go all the way back to the Axial Age, and we can look at the Stoics and the Cynics and say they're really the first Western anarchists. We can look at the Taoists and say they're really the first Eastern anarchists. We can look at some of the medieval peasant movements from the Middle Ages. We can look at traditions within traditional societies in Africa, among the Native Americans, among the Polynesians, among the Chinese, even among some Islamic societies, among Judaism, and see skepticism of state power, concentrated power, central power, an interest in decentralization, federalism, some of these kind of quasi-anarchistic ideas. There's a whole historical trajectory there to draw on. So that that in a nutshell is my case. Why I'm an anarchist and not a statist.
Yeah, actually, going through all that, there are two questions came to my mind to ask you. One question was, you were indicating that this artificial class that's supported by the state apparatus, you don't like it in part because it's an artificial class. But no, granted, you're not going to argue from some sort of objective moral standard. It's going to be more like, well, I prefer not to get murdered, so let's arrest criminals, and that makes it safer. But what if somebody could argue to you that having such a class does make life better, as all things being equal, that they can have maybe they have, because they have this level of autonomy due to having to sweat and toil, they can do things that otherwise couldn't be done. Doesn't have to be culture. Just there's just certain things that need to be done, but can only be done with a class like that.
Well, I would say at what cost?
Okay.
If it came down to having an exploited state on one hand and mass starvation on the other hand, well, maybe the exploited state doesn't look so bad. But again, it's a matter of scale. But I'd have to look at individual cases like that on a case by case basis. If we look at certain parts of the world today, where where you don't really have a state, you don't really have anarchism, you just have a failed state and civil war and chaos and things like that, then there may be situations where perhaps a state that at least creates stability is better than total chaos. For example, one obvious example of that is what has happened in Iraq. In Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, whatever else could be said about him, he at least repressed these kinds of really, anachronistic Islamic terrorist groups, ISIS type groups and stuff like that. And Iraq under Saddam Hussein, while it was certainly an authoritarian, tyrannical, quasi-totalitarian system, it wasn't ISIS. Maybe if the choice is Saddam Hussein or ISIS, I'd probably take Saddam Hussein. But again, it's a matter of circumstance, and it's a matter of scale. These are not absolute categories. I'm not going to say, well, no, I wouldn't want to have a society where marauding bands of lunatics like ISIS are running around cutting people's head off. Therefore, we need to have a state like the Ba'ath Party under Saddam Hussein. I think it's circumstantial.
Yeah. One more question I'd like to ask you is, I don't think you brought up this objection. Maybe you already did, but the objection from impossibility, i.e., which could be viewed in a couple of ways. The objection would be that anarchism has never really existed before, or if you appeal to some anthropological anarchists, in the hunter-gatherers, they'll say, okay, but that was back when life was brutish, nasty, and short, and nobody wants to go back to that. But anarchism in the modern-day sophisticated sense has never existed, and due to whatever causal natural factors really can never exist. Well, what would you respond to an argument like that from maybe the argument of impossibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. My response would be that I would see anarchism as being like world peace. It may be that world peace is not achievable on a perfect or absolute or permanent basis, but we should still have as much of it as we can. And I would say the same thing about anarchism. Perhaps it's not achievable on a perfect or absolute or permanent basis or universal basis, or however you even define that. But it's still a good idea to have as much of it as we can. To use the world peace analogy, it may be that there will always be wars and rumors of wars, but that doesn't mean we want to encourage wars. That doesn't mean we want to go out and try to choose the most warmongering leaders we can find and things like that. That's how I would see that issue. Whether the state is inevitable or not, I would say the state may be inevitable in the same sense that, like I said, tornadoes are inevitable and earthquakes are inevitable. Doesn't mean we want there to be tornadoes and earthquakes, and we don't try to find ways of safeguarding ourselves against those kinds of things.
Yeah. Okay, so is there anything that you want to say before we wrap this up, or did we sort of cover all the bases you wanted to hit?
I think I've pretty much covered it.
Yeah, okay, I'll just end by saying that I think, especially when with certain kinds of anarchists, but I think anarchists in general versus statists in general, certain metaphysical presuppositions are very important in determining how somebody falls on either side of this. If you're a moral absolutist, if you believe in a transcendent deity or the gods of Olympus, then an argument for state based on some appeal to divine authority is going to carry a lot more weight than somebody who's a nihilist or an atheist or an agnostic who views reality as this sort of meaningless system of interactions. And so, yeah, I think we're done for tonight. Thanks for coming on, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.